Joy Sinclair wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stacked the last of the dinner plates in the restaurant dishwasher. Her second job of the day was finally ending, and her feet ached from 12 hours of constant movement between the morning shift at the grocery store and this evening cleanup at Mario's kitchen. The clock on the wall showed 10:30, which meant she had just enough time to catch the last bus home to her daughter. Ariel would be asleep by now, curled up in the small bed they shared in their studio apartment. The babysitter, Mrs. Chun from next door, always made sure the 5-year-old was fed and bathed before Joy returned from her double shifts. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she was young, but it was honest work that kept them fed and housed. The restaurant manager handed her the day's tips, a modest collection of crumpled bills that would help cover this week's groceries. Joy thanked him quietly and gathered her worn purse, stepping out into the cool evening air. As she walked toward the bus stop, her mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with Ariel that morning. "Mommy, why don't I look like you?" the little girl had asked while brushing her teeth. It was a question that came up more frequently now that Ariel was old enough to notice the differences between them. Joy's dark skin and natural hair contrasted sharply with Ariel's lighter complexion and the distinctive facial features that marked her mixed heritage. "Because you look like your daddy, sweetheart," Joy had answered, the same response she always gave. But Ariel's follow-up question had been harder to deflect. "Where is Daddy, and why doesn't he come to see me?" Joy closed her eyes as the bus pulled up to the stop, the familiar ache settling in her chest. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that her father lived in a world of violence and power, that he had cast them away based on lies, that he probably didn't even know his daughter existed? 6 years ago, Joy had been a different person entirely. She was working as a translator for international business meetings, fluent in Korean from her college studies and passionate about bridging cultural gaps. That was how she had met Song Hukjin, when his syndicate needed someone who could handle delicate negotiations with American partners. She remembered the first time she saw him across the conference room, his presence commanding attention even in expensive suits that tried to make him look like a legitimate businessman. There was something magnetic about his quiet confidence, the way he listened more than he spoke, how his rare smile seemed reserved only for her. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on long conversations about literature and philosophy, shared meals where he taught her to appreciate authentic Korean cuisine, quiet evenings when he would show her the gentler side that existed beneath his dangerous reputation. For 18 months, Joy had lived in a bubble where love seemed stronger than the reality of what Song Hukjin truly was. I'm curious, where are you watching this story from tonight? Does your culture value family bonds and loyalty above everything else, the way Korean tradition does? Because Joy learned too late that in Hukjin's world, family meant everything, but trust could be destroyed by the right lies. Park Ji-hye had entered their lives like poison in still water. She was elegant and sophisticated, with connections to old Korean families that gave her credibility in traditional circles. More importantly, she had a young son who could serve as an heir to continue Hukjin's legacy. What Joy didn't understand then was how desperately Ji-hye wanted that position for herself and her child. The accusations came gradually at first. Important documents went missing after Joy had access to Hukjin's office. Confidential information somehow reached rival syndicates just after she attended strategy meetings. Each incident seemed innocent enough to explain away, but together they painted a picture of betrayal that Ji-hye carefully constructed. Joy found the bus seat and settled in for the 20-minute ride home, her reflection ghosting across the dark window. She could still remember the night everything collapsed, when Dr. Kim arrived at Hukjin's compound with what he claimed was proof of her treachery. The medical files showed that Joy had been meeting regularly with federal investigators, providing them with health records and personal information about syndicate members in exchange for immunity. The documents looked authentic, complete with her forged signature and detailed notes about conversations she had supposedly recorded. Hukjin's face had gone cold in a way she had never seen before. The man who held her gently just hours earlier now looked at her like she was a stranger who had invaded his home. When she tried to explain, to protest her innocence, his silence cut deeper than any accusation. "You're pregnant," he had said quietly, and Joy's heart had leaped with hope that this news might change everything. Instead, his next words destroyed her world. "Is it even mine, or is that part of your cover story too?" The exile happened within hours. Hutchins' men drove her to the airport with a one-way ticket and enough cash to survive for a few months. No explanations were given to other syndicate members, no trial or chance to defend herself. She was simply erased from their world like she had never existed. Joy had spent the pregnancy alone in a different city, working whatever jobs she could find while her belly grew larger. When Ariel was born, Joy held her daughter and saw Song Hukjin's eyes looking back at her, the same distinctive shape and deep brown color that had first drawn her attention across that conference room. Now, 6 years later, she was raising that little girl on grocery store wages and restaurant tips, protecting her from the truth about her father's world while wondering if Song Hukjin ever thought about what he had lost. The bus pulled up to her stop, and Joy gathered her things for the short walk to their building. Tomorrow would bring another double shift, another day of careful budgeting and tired feet. But tonight, she would check on her sleeping daughter and remember that some kinds of love survive even when trust is broken. Dr. Kim's guilty conscience had been eating at him for years, though Joy didn't know that yet. The medical professional who had falsified those documents under Park Ji-hai's threats often found himself staring at Joy's files, remembering how young and desperate she had looked the night he destroyed her life with his lies. In his private moments, he wondered what had become of the pregnant woman who was cast out based on his fabricated evidence. He wondered if she had survived, if the child had been born healthy, if somehow justice might still find a way to correct the terrible wrong he had helped create. But those were thoughts for sleepless nights. During the day, Dr. Kim continued his work within the syndicate, carrying the weight of his cowardice, while Park Ji-hai built her position as Song Hukjin's trusted partner and the mother of his presumed heir. The crystal chandelier cast elegant shadows across the polished mahogany table where Song Hukjin reviewed the final arrangements for what would be the most important ceremony of his life. The succession announcement had been planned for months, every detail crafted to demonstrate the strength and continuity of the Warong syndicate under his leadership. Park Ji-hai sat beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers arranging photographs of her son Minsu in various formal poses. The 12-year-old boy would soon be presented as Hukjin's heir, the next generation to carry forward the syndicate's legacy. She had spent years positioning herself and her son for this moment, and now it was finally within reach. The boy needs to project confidence during the blood recognition ceremony, Ji-hai said, studying the images with critical eyes. The elders will be watching for any signs of weakness or hesitation. He must appear naturally comfortable with his place in the family line. Hukjin nodded absently, his attention focused on the guest list spreadsheet displayed on his tablet. 300 of the most powerful figures in their world would attend, including rival syndicate leaders who needed to witness this transition of power. The ceremony would serve multiple purposes beyond simple succession, sending clear messages about alliances and future territorial arrangements. Minsu entered the room carrying his formal ceremony robes, the traditional Korean hanbok modified with subtle symbols of syndicate authority. Park Ji-hai immediately rose to inspect the fit, adjusting the collar and smoothing the fabric while reviewing his rehearsed responses to anticipated questions. "Remember what we practiced about the family history," she instructed quietly. "When Elder Cho asks about your bloodline connection, you recite the genealogy back 3 generations. When they ask about your understanding of syndicate values, you speak about honor and loyalty, protecting family above all else." The boy nodded solemnly, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty about the weight being placed on his young shoulders. Hukjin watched the interaction with growing satisfaction, seeing his legacy secured through this intelligent and well-prepared child. Yet as the days passed, a different kind of satisfaction began forming in Hukjin's mind. The ceremony represented triumph not just over rival syndicates, but over the personal betrayals that had threatened to destroy him. The woman who had tried to sell his secrets to federal investigators should witness how completely he had rebuilt without her treachery. The idea came to him during a late evening meeting with his security chief. They were discussing final protection arrangements when Hukjin found himself thinking about Joy Sinclair, wondering what had become of the pregnant traitor he had exiled 6 years earlier. Surely she had struggled, possibly failed completely without the luxury and protection his world had provided. "Send an invitation to Joy Sinclair," he told his assistant the following morning. "The same elegant cardstock we're using for distinguished guests, but include accommodation at the Grand Metropolitan. I want her to see exactly what she lost when she chose to betray my trust." His staff member looked confused, but made careful notes about locating her current address. Hukjin felt a dark pleasure imagining her reaction to receiving such an invitation, probably from some rundown apartment where she was barely surviving on whatever menial work she could find. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as gracious hospitality. The heavy cream paper bore the Warong Syndicate crest in gold embossing, with formal Korean calligraphy announcing the succession ceremony. Hotel arrangements were included as though she remained an honored guest rather than a discredited exile. Park Ji-hye discovered the invitation on his desk and immediately understood its purpose. She felt a brief chill of concern, remembering how completely joy had captured Hukjin's attention during their relationship. But 6 years had passed, and Ji-hye's position was now unshakable. If anything, Joy's presence would highlight how far Ji-hye had risen while her rival had fallen. "Let her come," Ji-hye agreed when Hukjin explained his reasoning. "Let her see Minsu being crowned as your heir while she watches from the audience with whatever pathetic life she's managed to scrape together. The contrast will be delicious." Meanwhile, Dr. Kim was reviewing medical protocols for the ceremony when he overheard staff discussing Joy's invitation. The guilt he had carried for years suddenly intensified, knowing that the woman he had helped destroy with fabricated evidence would soon return to witness the triumph of her betrayer. Elder Cho was also reviewing the guest list when Joy's name caught his attention. He remembered her well from the old days, how respectfully she had conducted herself during business meetings, how genuinely she had seemed to care for Hukjin before her sudden disappearance. The invitation struck him as unnecessarily cruel, but he said nothing about his concerns. The syndicate's inner circle had grown accustomed to not questioning Hukjin's more personal decisions, especially those involving former relationships. Still, several elders had quietly expressed doubts about rushing the succession ceremony, wondering if more time might reveal important details about bloodlines and legitimacy. Minsu's resemblance to Hukjin was subtle at best, requiring generous interpretation to see family connections. His personality was gentle and scholarly, lacking the natural intensity that marked true syndicate bloodlines. Park Ji-hye insisted these differences were positive traits, signs of evolution rather than weakness. But Elder Cho had been evaluating potential heirs for 40 years, and something felt incomplete about this succession. The traditional ceremonies required blood verification for precisely these reasons, to ensure legitimacy beyond mere convenience or political positioning. 3 days before the ceremony, the ornate invitation arrived at Joy's small apartment building. Mrs. Chun signed for the expensive delivery, noting the sender's prestigious address and the weight of the envelope. When Joy returned from her afternoon shift at the grocery store, the invitation waited on her tiny kitchen table like an elegant balm. Ariel was playing with her few toys in the corner when Joy opened the heavy paper, revealing the formal announcement and luxury hotel arrangements. The little girl looked up curiously at her mother's sharp intake of breath, wondering why the pretty card had caused such a strong reaction. "What's that, Mommy?" Ariel asked, abandoning her dolls to examine the golden lettering. "It looks very fancy and important." Joy stared at the invitation, her mind reeling between anger and disbelief. Song Hukjin was crowning an heir, establishing his legacy for the next generation. And he wanted her to witness this triumph, to see how completely he had moved forward while she struggled to survive. "It's an invitation to a very special party," Joy explained carefully, not wanting to frighten her daughter with the complicated emotions churning in her chest. "Someone I used to know is having an important ceremony." Ariel studied the invitation with 5-year-old curiosity, tracing the elegant Korean characters with her small finger. "Can we go to the party?" she asked innocently. "I've never been to a fancy party before." Joy's heart clenched as she looked at her daughter, seeing Song Hukjin's features reflected in the child's face. Ariel had never met her father, never experienced the luxury that should have been her birthright, never known anything but their modest apartment and second-hand clothes. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Joy. Song Hukjin was celebrating his heir while his real daughter lived in poverty, unknown and unacknowledged. The invitation was meant to humiliate her, but it had also given her an unexpected opportunity. "Maybe we can go," Joy said quietly, already calculating how she might afford appropriate clothing for such an event. "Maybe it's time for some people to see how beautiful you've grown." Joy stood before the small mirror in their apartment bathroom, carefully applying the makeup she had borrowed from her neighbor. The dress hanging on the back of the door was the nicest thing she owned, a simple black sheath she had bought years ago for job interviews that never came. It would have to be elegant enough for the most important syndicate ceremony in a decade. Ariel sat on the edge of the bathtub, watching her mother's preparations with fascination. The little girl wore a navy blue dress that Joy had found at a thrift store and altered to fit perfectly. With her hair brushed into soft waves and her natural grace, Ariel looked like she belonged in much finer surroundings than their modest apartment. "You look beautiful, Mommy," Ariel said, reaching up to touch the pearl earrings that were Joy's only remaining jewelry from her previous life. "Are you nervous about the fancy party?" "A little," Joy admitted, checking her reflection one final time. "But sometimes we have to be brave and show people who we really are, even when it's scary." The taxi ride to the Grand Metropolitan Hotel cost more than Joy usually spent on groceries in a week, but the invitation had been explicit about the venue's importance. As they approached the towering glass building, Joy felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The hotel lobby buzzed with activity as elegantly dressed guests moved toward the ceremonial hall. Joy recognized the careful formality that marked syndicate gatherings, the way conversations stopped when certain people passed, the subtle positioning that indicated hierarchy and respect. Elder Cho was reviewing the guest reception list when he noticed a familiar figure entering through the main doors. His weathered face registered surprise, and then something approaching concern as he recognized Joy Sinclair after 6 years of absence. But it was the child beside her that made him pause completely. The little girl moved with unconscious grace, her mixed heritage evident in features that seemed hauntingly familiar. Elder Cho had witnessed enough family ceremonies to recognize bloodline characteristics, and what he saw in this child sent a chill through his understanding of the evening's proceedings. Joy felt eyes tracking her movement through the lobby, whispered conversations starting and stopping as guests tried to place her face. She kept her chin high and her hand gently guiding Ariel toward the reception area, determined to maintain dignity despite the stares. The ceremonial hall itself was magnificent, with traditional Korean decorative elements mixed with modern luxury. Photographs lined the walls showing the history of the Warong Syndicate, including formal portraits of Song Hukjin from various stages of his leadership. Joy's breath caught as Ariel stopped before one particular image. "Mommy," Ariel said with 5-year-old directness, "that man looks like me. He has the same eyes and the same nose shape." Several nearby guests overheard the comment and turned to observe the child more carefully. The resemblance Ariel had noted was impossible to ignore once pointed out. The bone structure, the distinctive eye shape, even the way she held her head while speaking, all echoed the man in the photograph with startling clarity. Joy's heart pounded as she realized their entrance was creating exactly the kind of attention she had hoped for. Around the hall, syndicate members were beginning to murmur among themselves, comparing the child's features to the family portraits that decorated the walls. Park Ji-hai noticed the disturbance from across the room, where she was making final adjustments to Minsu's ceremonial robes. When she saw Joy standing beneath Hukjin's portrait with a child who bore an unmistakable family resemblance, panic began rising in her chest like ice water. This was not supposed to happen. Joy Sinclair was supposed to arrive alone, humbled and defeated, to witness Park Ji-hai's triumph. The presence of this child changed everything, threatened everything that Ji-hai had worked years to build. Song Hukjin emerged from the preparation area to greet distinguished guests when he saw the crowd gathered around the portrait wall. His eyes found Joy immediately, noting how time had changed her, how poverty had marked her but not broken her essential dignity. Then he saw the little girl beside her. The world seemed to stop as Hukjin stared at his own features reflected in a child's face. The resemblance was so strong it felt like looking at childhood photographs of himself, the same bone structure and expressions that had marked his family line for generations. This was his daughter, the child Joy had been carrying when he exiled her in fury and betrayal. Elder Cho approached them with careful formality, his experienced eyes taking in details that would have escaped less observant guests. "Joy," he said quietly, "it has been many years since we last met. I trust you have been well." "As well as can be expected," Joy replied, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her chest. "Thank you for asking, Elder Cho. This is my daughter Ariel." The elder studied the child with growing amazement, seeing not just physical resemblance, but the unconscious mannerisms that spoke of true bloodline connection. When Ariel smiled politely and bowed slightly as Joy had quietly coached her in the taxi, Elder Cho recognized the gesture as naturally graceful rather than taught. "She is very beautiful," Elder Cho said carefully. "She has her father's eyes." The comment was deliberate, loud enough for nearby guests to overhear and interpret. Conversations around them began shifting as the implications of Elder Cho's observations spread through the gathering like ripples in still water. "You know, I've been thinking about family connections all evening," Joy said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach interested ears. "It's fascinating how children can carry forward their parents' features so clearly. Ariel asks me constantly why she looks different from me, and I always tell her it's because she looks like her daddy instead." The crowd around them was growing larger as more guests became aware of the drama unfolding near the portrait wall. Professional photographers hired to document the succession ceremony began capturing candid shots, not yet understanding that they were recording evidence of a bloodline revelation that would transform the evening. Park Ji-hye pushed through the gathering crowd, her composure beginning to crack as she saw the undeniable truth written in the child's features. She had spent years ensuring that Song Hukjin never learned about Joy's pregnancy outcome, carefully managing information to prevent exactly this kind of revelation. Minsu followed behind his mother, and the contrast between the two children became immediately apparent to anyone with eyes. Where Ariel carried obvious family resemblance to the portraits surrounding them, Minsu's features showed no clear connection to the Warong bloodline. Joy noticed the approaching woman and recognized Park Ji-hye immediately despite the years that had passed. The elegant clothing and confident posture could not disguise the calculating look in her eyes, the same expression Joy remembered from their brief encounters years ago. "Ji-hye," Joy said with cool politeness. "How nice to see you again. You look very well. This must be your son I've heard about." The formal introduction brought the two children face to face, creating a visual comparison that several guests began photographing with their phones. The difference in bloodline characteristics became impossible to ignore, raising questions that rippled through the assembled syndicate leadership. Elder Cho stepped back slightly, allowing other guests to observe the interaction while making mental notes about everything he was witnessing. His role as senior advisor would require him to report these developments to the full Council of Elders, but first he needed to understand exactly what was unfolding. Song Hukjin remained frozen near the preparation area entrance, his mind reeling between rage and wonder as he stared at the daughter he never knew existed. 6 years of believing Joy had betrayed him, 6 years of building his life around that betrayal, and now facing the possibility that everything he believed might have been built on lies. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, but already the evening was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Guests continued arriving, many immediately drawn to the crowd surrounding the portrait wall where a drama of bloodline and succession was playing out in real time. Ariel remained blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding her, simply pleased to be at such a beautiful party with her mother. She pointed to different photographs along the wall, asking innocent questions about the people in the pictures while unknowingly providing more evidence of her family connection with every gesture and expression. Joy maintained her composure as the center of growing attention, answering polite questions and making careful observations while allowing the truth to reveal itself naturally. She had come here expecting humiliation, but instead found herself holding the most powerful cards in a game that Park Ji-hye had thought was already won. The evening's carefully planned succession ceremony was about to become something entirely different, and everyone in that hall was beginning to understand that they were witnessing history in the making. Elder Cho's weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he gestured for the crowd to quiet around them. His authority within the syndicate hierarchy meant that when he spoke, even the most powerful guests stopped their conversations to listen. The formal ceremony had not yet begun, but something far more significant was unfolding in real time. "Young lady," he addressed Ariel directly, his voice carrying the gentle tone reserved for children but loud enough for surrounding guests to hear clearly. "You mentioned that gentleman in the portrait looks like you. Tell me, what is your family name?" Ariel looked up at the distinguished elder with perfect 5-year-old confidence, unaware that her answer would shift the entire foundation of the evening's planned events. "My name is Ariel Sinclair," she said clearly. "My mommy says I look like my daddy, but I've never met him before." The murmur that rippled through the gathered crowd was like electricity passing through water. Several guests immediately pulled out their phones, discreetly photographing the child's profile against the family portraits that lined the ceremonial hall walls. The resemblance that had been notable from a distance became absolutely undeniable when viewed side by side with Song Hukjin's official photographs. Elder Cho nodded thoughtfully, his experienced eyes cataloging every detail of the child's appearance. The bone structure, the distinctive eye shape, the way she tilted her head when speaking, all matched the family characteristics he had observed across 3 generations of Warong leadership. More importantly, these were traits that could not be taught or imitated, genetic markers that spoke to authentic bloodline connection. "Mrs. Sinclair," Elder Cho continued, turning his attention to Joy while maintaining his formal but respectful tone. "Your daughter bears remarkable resemblance to certain family characteristics that are quite distinctive. I wonder if you might share her father's name with us." Joy felt every eye in the surrounding crowd focused on her response. This was the moment she had both hoped for and dreaded during the taxi ride to the hotel. 6 years of exile and struggle had led to this instant where truth could finally be spoken before witnesses who mattered. "Her father's name is Song Hukjin," Joy said with quiet dignity. "Ariel was born 7 months after I was exiled from this community. I have spent 6 years raising his daughter alone while he prepared to crown another child as his heir." The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations erupted around them as syndicate members processed the implications of this revelation. The succession ceremony they had come to witness was suddenly thrown into question by the appearance of a potential heir who had been completely unknown to the organization. Park Ji-hai felt the blood drain from her face as she watched years of careful planning crumble around her. She had worked so hard to ensure that Song Hukjin never learned about Joy's pregnancy outcome, carefully managing information flow and maintaining the fiction that the exiled woman had disappeared completely from their world. "That's impossible," Ji-hai said loudly, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd with desperate authority. "This woman was exiled for betraying syndicate secrets to federal investigators. She cannot be trusted to tell the truth about anything, especially something as important as bloodline claims." But Elder Cho was already examining his phone, scrolling through family photographs that clearly showed the hereditary traits now visible in Ariel's young face. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, and his role as senior advisor required him to acknowledge what was obvious to anyone with experience in bloodline verification. "The resemblance is quite remarkable," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should arrange for proper documentation and verification before tonight's ceremony proceeds. These matters require careful attention to ensure legitimacy." Song Hukjin finally moved through the crowd toward the developing confrontation, his mind reeling between anger and wonder as he approached the child who might be his daughter. 6 years of believing himself betrayed, 6 years of building his succession plans around Park Ji-hai's son, and now facing the possibility that his real heir had been hidden from him all this time. When he reached the edge of the gathered crowd, Hukjin found himself staring directly at Ariel for the first time. The resemblance was so strong it felt like a physical blow, seeing his own childhood features reflected in this little girl's face. There was no question, no possibility of mistake. This was his daughter. Ariel looked up at the man approaching them and tilted her head with curious recognition. "You're the man in the picture," she said with innocent directness. "The one who looks like me. Are you my daddy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the evening had been planned to accomplish. Around them, photographers continued capturing candid shots while guests whispered among themselves about the unfolding drama. The formal succession ceremony was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, but everyone present understood that those plans were now meaningless. Dr. Kim arrived at the ceremonial hall carrying the medical blessing that traditionally opens such important gatherings. When he saw Joy standing near the portrait wall with a child beside her, his step faltered and the color drained from his weathered face. The guilt he had carried for 6 years suddenly intensified as he realized the full scope of the damage his falsified documents had created. The pregnant woman he had helped exile was standing here with what was obviously Song Hukjin's biological daughter. The child he had helped deny her birthright was now 5 years old, beautiful and healthy, raised in poverty, while Park Ji-hye's son prepared to claim her inheritance. Joy noticed Dr. Kim's arrival and the stricken expression that crossed his face when he saw her. She remembered him from the night of her exile, how he had produced the fabricated medical evidence that convinced Song Hukjin of her treachery. Now his guilty conscience was written clearly across his features for anyone observant enough to read. Meanwhile, professional photographers hired to document the succession ceremony found themselves capturing something entirely different. Their cameras recorded the obvious family resemblance between Ariel and the Warong portraits, the stark contrast between her natural grace and Minsu's apparent discomfort with the growing attention. The syndicate's head of security was quietly reviewing archived footage from the building's cameras, checking previous gatherings to confirm Joy's past behavior and associations. What he found contradicted everything in the official exile narrative. The recordings showed a woman who had conducted herself with perfect respect and propriety during her time in their world. Park Ji-hye desperately tried to redirect conversation back to the planned ceremony, reminding guests that months of preparation had led to this important moment for the syndicate's future. But her words fell flat against the visual evidence that surrounded them. Minsu stood beside her looking increasingly uncomfortable as more guests noticed his lack of resemblance to the family bloodline. Elder Cho was making quiet notes in his phone, documenting everything he observed for the formal report he would need to provide to the full Council of Elders. The succession ceremony could not proceed without proper verification of bloodline claims, especially with such compelling evidence of an alternative heir now present. The traditional Korean music that had been playing softly in the background seemed inappropriate now as the gathering transformed from celebration to investigation. Guests continued arriving for the ceremony, immediately drawn into the drama unfolding near the portrait wall where family history was being rewritten in real time. Song Hukjin remained silent, studying his daughter's face while his mind processed the implications of her existence. If this was truly his child, then everything he had believed about Joy's betrayal needed to be reconsidered. If the accusations against her had been false, then someone else was responsible for the lies that had destroyed his family. Joy maintained her composure as the center of intense scrutiny, answering questions with careful honesty while protecting Ariel from understanding the full complexity of what was happening around them. She had come here expecting humiliation, but instead found herself holding evidence that could transform the entire power structure of the Warong Syndicate. The ceremonial hall buzzed with conversations as syndicate members processed what they were witnessing. Phone calls were being made to absent council members, urgent consultations about protocol and procedure when succession plans were challenged by new bloodline evidence. Ariel remained wonderfully oblivious to the political earthquake she had triggered simply by existing, pleased to be at such an elegant party and curious about the formal Korean decorations that surrounded them. Her innocent questions and natural mannerisms continued providing evidence of her heritage with every word and gesture. The evening's carefully orchestrated succession ceremony was dissolving into chaos, but from that chaos, truth was finally beginning to emerge after 6 years of careful lies and manipulation. Dr. Kim stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his medical bag trembling in his weathered hands as 6 years of guilt finally overwhelmed his ability to remain silent. The sight of Joy Sinclair with her daughter, the obvious family resemblance that he had helped deny, and the mounting evidence of his complicity in a massive deception drove him past his breaking point. The distinguished physician who had served the syndicate for 2 decades suddenly stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations with unexpected authority. "I need to speak," he announced, his words carrying the weight of professional confession. "There are things about Mrs. Sinclair's exile that this community needs to know before any succession ceremony proceeds." Elder Cho immediately recognized the significance of Dr. Kim's intervention and gestured for complete silence in the ceremonial hall. The physician's role in medical verification made his testimony crucial to understanding the bloodline questions that had erupted around them. The medical evidence used to exile Joy Sinclair 6 years ago was fabricated, Dr. Kim said, his voice growing stronger as the truth finally escaped after years of torment. I falsified those documents under threats from Park Ji-hai. The meetings with federal investigators never happened. The recorded conversations were complete fiction. I manufactured all of it because I was told my own family would suffer if I refused. The silence that followed his confession was absolute. 300 of the syndicate's most powerful members absorbed the implications of what they had just heard. The woman they had watched disappear in disgrace had been innocent, framed by someone they had trusted and elevated within their organization. Park Ji-hai felt the foundation of her world collapsing beneath her feet as Dr. Kim's words destroyed years of careful construction. Everything she had built, every position she had gained, every plan she had made for Minsu's future was suddenly exposed as fraudulent manipulation built on fabricated evidence. "That's completely false," she said desperately, her voice rising with panic as she tried to salvage the situation. Dr. Kim is obviously being influenced by this woman's return. He's confused about events that happened years ago. The evidence against her was thoroughly verified at the time. But Elder Cho was already reviewing archived files on his phone, cross-referencing dates and medical protocols with growing understanding of how the deception had been constructed. His experience with syndicate documentation allowed him to quickly identify the inconsistencies that should have been noticed years earlier. Dr. Kim continued his confession, his professional reputation lending weight to every word. "I was approached by Park Ji-hai 6 months before the exile occurred. She provided detailed instructions about what evidence would be needed to convince Song Hukjin of betrayal. She had already identified specific federal investigators and meeting locations that would seem credible. The entire narrative was constructed in advance. The crowd around them had grown to include nearly every guest at the ceremony as word spread about the dramatic confession unfolding near the portrait wall. Professional photographers continued documenting everything, unknowingly recording evidence that would transform syndicate leadership for years to come. Song Hukjin stood frozen as the doctor's words systematically destroyed everything he had believed about the most painful period of his life. The woman he had loved and trusted, the pregnancy that should have brought joy, the family he had cast away in anger, all of it had been stolen from him through calculated lies. Joy felt vindication and heartbreak warring in her chest as the truth she had tried to explain 6 years ago finally emerged before witnesses who mattered. But knowing she had been right provided little comfort when measured against the years of struggle and the childhood her daughter had been denied. Elder Cho stepped forward with formal authority, his voice carrying the weight of syndicate law and tradition. "These accusations require immediate investigation and verification. We cannot proceed with any succession ceremony while fundamental questions of legitimacy and bloodline remain unresolved." The elder's pronouncement triggered a flurry of activity as senior council members began making urgent phone calls to absent colleagues. The succession ceremony represented months of planning and significant political investment, but syndicate law demanded absolute certainty about bloodline verification before any heir could be formally recognized. Park Ji-hai realized that her confession strategy was failing and desperately shifted to attacking Dr. Kim's credibility. "He's been drinking heavily for years," she declared. "Everyone knows his judgment has been compromised by guilt and alcohol. These accusations are the ravings of a man trying to shift blame for his own professional failures." But the physician was prepared for such attacks and pulled a file from his medical bag containing copies of the original falsified documents alongside authentic medical records that told a completely different story. The evidence was meticulously organized and professionally presented, clearly demonstrating the systematic nature of the deception. "I kept copies of everything," Dr. Kim explained to the assembled crowd. "My conscience would not allow me to destroy the evidence of what I had done, even when Park Ji-hai ordered me to eliminate all traces of the fabrication. These documents show exactly how the false narrative was constructed and by whom." Elder Cho examined the documents with growing amazement at the scope and sophistication of the fraud that had been perpetrated against their organization. The falsified medical records, the manufactured meeting reports, the carefully timed evidence presentation, all of it demonstrated planning that went far beyond simple jealousy or romantic rivalry. The blood verification protocols demanded by syndicate tradition suddenly took on urgent importance as the assembled leadership realized they needed definitive proof of all bloodline claims being made that evening. Both children would need to undergo testing to establish their true parentage and inheritance rights. Song Hukjin finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper as the full scope of his loss became clear. "You destroyed my family," he said to Park Ji-hai, his words carrying decades of accumulated authority and barely controlled rage. "You stole my daughter's childhood and my chance to be her father. You turned me into a weapon against the woman I loved." Minsu had been listening to the adult conversation with growing confusion and fear as he began understanding that his entire identity within the syndicate was being called into question. The 12-year-old boy looked between his mother and the man he had been raised to call father with dawning realization that nothing was as he had believed. The medical equipment necessary for immediate blood verification was summoned from the syndicate's private medical facility, along with laboratory technicians who could provide results within hours rather than days. The succession ceremony was officially postponed pending resolution of the bloodline questions that now dominated all other considerations. Joy knelt beside Ariel to explain that they would need to provide blood samples for testing, carefully framing the procedure as routine medical care rather than paternity verification. The 5-year-old accepted the explanation with typical childhood resilience, more interested in the elegant surroundings than the political earthquake occurring around them. Elder Cho was consulting with other senior council members about the unprecedented situation they faced. Never in the syndicate's history had a succession ceremony been disrupted by such dramatic evidence of fraud and hidden bloodlines. The protocols they were following had been designed for simpler disputes, not systematic deception that spanned multiple years. The investigation expanded beyond simple paternity testing as security personnel began reviewing financial records to trace Park Ji-hai's payments to Dr. Kim and other potential conspirators. The scope of the deception was becoming clear as evidence emerged of a years-long campaign to eliminate Joy and position Minsu as the only possible heir. Park Ji-hai's desperation reached new heights as she realized that blood verification would destroy not just her succession plans, but potentially her entire position within the syndicate. If Minsu proved to be unrelated to Song Hukjin, her own status as trusted partner and advisor would be revealed as completely fraudulent. The ceremonial hall had transformed from celebration venue to investigation headquarters as syndicate leadership grappled with revelations that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their planned succession. Guests who had arrived expecting routine pageantry found themselves witnessing the exposure of one of the most sophisticated internal deceptions in their organization's history. Song Hukjin approached Joy for the first time since her exile, his face carrying the weight of 6 years of regret and growing understanding of how completely he had been manipulated. The conversation they needed to have would require privacy and time, but first the bloodline questions had to be resolved definitively. Ariel remained wonderfully oblivious to the adult drama surrounding her, pleased to be the center of so much attention and curious about the medical equipment being assembled nearby. Her innocent presence served as a constant reminder of what had been lost and what might still be recovered from the wreckage of fabricated evidence and destroyed trust. The laboratory results arrived with the weight of absolute authority, printed on official syndicate medical letterhead and bearing the signatures of 3 independent technicians. Elder Cho held the documents with steady hands as he prepared to announce findings that would reshape the organization's entire future. "The blood verification is conclusive," he declared to the assembled syndicate leadership, his voice carrying across the ceremonial hall with formal gravity. "Ariel Sinclair is the biological daughter of Song Hukjin with 99.7% certainty. The child we have been presented as heir shows no genetic relationship to the Warong bloodline." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Park Ji-hai's sharp intake of breath as years of careful planning crumbled into irreversible ruin. Minsu stood beside her with the confused expression of a 12-year-old boy whose entire identity had just been stripped away in front of 300 witnesses. Song Hukjin stared at the official confirmation of what his heart had recognized the moment he saw Ariel's face. His daughter, his real heir, had been living in poverty while he prepared to crown another man's child. The cruelty of his own actions 6 years ago now seemed like cosmic justice turned against him. Joy felt vindication war with exhaustion as the truth she had tried to speak for 6 years was finally acknowledged by the people who mattered. But official recognition provided little comfort when measured against the childhood her daughter had been denied and the years of struggle they had endured alone. Elder Cho continued reading from the formal report, his words carrying the weight of syndicate law and tradition. Based on these findings and the evidence of systematic fraud presented this evening, the succession ceremony scheduled for tonight is hereby canceled pending full investigation into the deception perpetrated against this organization. The announcement triggered immediate activity as security personnel moved to detain Park Ji-hai for questioning, while medical staff collected additional evidence from the falsified documents Dr. Kim had preserved. The elegant ceremony had transformed into a criminal investigation with implications that would ripple through the syndicate for years. Park Ji-hai's composure finally shattered completely as she realized the magnitude of her downfall. Everything she had worked for, every position she had gained, every plan she had made for her son's future was being destroyed before the most powerful witnesses in their world. The woman who had orchestrated Joy's exile now faced her own removal from the organization in disgrace. "You have destroyed everything," she screamed at Joy across the ceremonial hall, her voice breaking with desperation and rage. "We built a life here. We had plans. We had a future. Your return has ruined it all for nothing more than petty revenge." But Joy's response carried the quiet dignity that had sustained her through 6 years of poverty and struggle. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said clearly, her voice reaching every corner of the hall. "I came here because you invited me to witness your triumph. Instead, your own deception has exposed the truth that was always waiting to be discovered." Song Hukjin approached Joy with hesitant steps, his face carrying the weight of 6 years of regret and growing understanding of how completely he had failed the people he should have protected. The conversation they needed to have would determine whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage of their destroyed relationship. "Joy," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the activity surrounding them. "I know words cannot repair what I have done. I know apologies cannot return the years you have lost or give Ariel the childhood she deserved. But please let me try to make amends." Joy studied the man who had once been everything to her, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes alongside the desperate hope that forgiveness might be possible. But 6 years of struggle had changed her in fundamental ways, and the woman who stood before him was no longer the person who had been exiled in heartbreak and confusion. "You made your choice 6 years ago," she replied with calm finality. "You chose to believe lies instead of trusting the woman you claimed to love. You chose anger over investigation, exile over conversation. Those choices have consequences that cannot be undone with apologies." Elder Cho was consulting with other senior council members about the unprecedented situation they faced, but his attention kept returning to the conversation between Joy and Song Hukjin. The syndicate's future leadership hung in the balance of decisions being made in real time by people whose lives had been shattered by deception. According to traditional law and bloodline verification, Ariel Sinclair is now the recognized heir to the Warong Syndicate, Elder Cho announced formally. As her mother and guardian, Joyce Sinclair holds authority over succession decisions until the child reaches maturity. The pronouncement sent shock waves through the assembled crowd as the implications became clear. The woman who had been exiled in disgrace 6 years earlier now controlled the organization's entire future through her daughter's legitimate claim to leadership. Joy looked down at Ariel, who was sitting quietly beside her, still wearing the navy blue dress from the thrift store, but now officially recognized as one of the most powerful children in their city. The 5-year-old remained blissfully unaware that she had inherited an empire built on violence and control. "I think it's time for us to go home," Joy said, taking Ariel's small hand in hers. "This world has already taken enough from both of us. We don't need anything more from it." Song Hukjin felt panic rising in his chest as he realized that Joy intended to walk away from everything, taking his daughter and his legacy with her into a life he would never be part of. The cruel invitation he had sent to humiliate her had instead given her ultimate power over his world, and she was choosing to reject it completely. "You cannot just leave," he said desperately. "Ariel is my daughter. She deserves to know her heritage, to understand her place in this family. Please don't take her away again." But Joy's decision had been made years ago during those long nights working double shifts to keep them housed and fed. She had built a life for herself and Ariel outside this world of violence and betrayal, and she would not sacrifice her daughter's innocence to satisfy anyone else's needs for legacy or redemption. She deserves to grow up safe and loved, which is exactly what she's had for 5 years without any help from this family. Joy replied firmly. "I won't let her become part of a world that destroys people for convenience and builds power on lies." The assembled syndicate leadership watched in stunned silence as Joy gathered her purse and prepared to leave with the child who represented their organization's legitimate future. No one had anticipated that the true heir might simply refuse to claim her inheritance. Elder Cho stepped forward one final time, his voice carrying both respect and concern for the unprecedented situation. "Mrs. Sinclair, the syndicate recognizes Ariel's claim and your authority as her guardian. But we hope you will consider that rejecting this inheritance entirely may not be in her best interests as she grows older." Joy paused at the ceremonial hall entrance, looking back at the elegant surroundings where her daughter's birthright had finally been acknowledged. For a moment, she considered the security and opportunities that acceptance might provide. Then she thought about the price such acceptance would demand. "Maybe someday Ariel will choose this world for herself," Joy said finally. "But that choice will be hers to make when she's old enough to understand what it truly means. Until then, I will protect her from it the same way I've protected her from everything else that could harm her." Song Hukjin watched helplessly as Joy walked toward the exit with their daughter, understanding that his cruel invitation had achieved the exact opposite of what he had intended. Instead of witnessing Joy's humiliation, he was watching his own empire crumble as the woman he had wronged chose dignity over revenge. The syndicate members who remained in the ceremonial hall faced the unprecedented situation of having no legitimate heir and no clear path forward for their organization. The succession crisis that had erupted from Park Ji-hai's deception would require months of investigation and careful rebuilding of their leadership structure. As Joy and Ariel disappeared into the hotel lobby, the little girl asked innocent questions about the fancy party and why they were leaving so early. Joy explained that sometimes important things happen at parties that take time for grown-ups to understand, but that they had their own home to return to where everything was simple and safe. The taxi ride back to their modest apartment was quiet except for Ariel's sleepy observations about the elegant people and beautiful decorations she had seen. Joy held her daughter close and realized that despite everything they had discovered that evening, nothing fundamental had changed about their life together. "I have to ask, where do you think family loyalty should end and personal happiness should begin? Do people deserve second chances after they've destroyed trust so completely?" Because Joy had chosen protection over power, dignity over revenge, and the simple love she had built with Ariel over the complex legacy that had been offered and rejected. Behind them at the Grand Metropolitan, Song Hukjin stood alone in the empty ceremonial hall, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors and the wreckage of his own choices. The succession ceremony that was supposed to secure his legacy had instead revealed how completely he had destroyed it through his willingness to believe lies over love. Park Ji-hai was led away by security while Elder Cho began the difficult process of explaining to the Syndicate Council how their organization would function without a confirmed heir or clear succession plan. The evening that had begun with celebration would end with investigation, reconstruction, and the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by years of systematic deception. Joy and Ariel returned to their small apartment, where Mrs. Chun was waiting with leftover soup and gentle questions about their evening. The 5-year-old fell asleep quickly in their shared bed, while Joy sat by the window, processing everything that had happened and everything that would never happen because of the choice she had made. The real heir had departed, not in anger or triumph, but in quiet determination to protect the life they had built together outside a world that had already taken too much from both of them.